want to work on the post action method for index. So let me copy this and paste it right here. Now, if you are following this course with the other section like blob storage and Azure function, then you already know how we will be uploading the JSON object as well as blob that we capture. We will be receiving an object of the model spooky request. And once we request that, we need to populate the ID field. If you notice, the model for spooky request ID is a string. So we will say spooky request.id is equal to guid.newguid.toString. Once we have the spooky request object, we will convert that to JSON using JSON convert, and we will have to install the NuGet package newtonsoft.json. We will install the latest version for newtonsoft.json. Once we have the JSON object, we need to post this message to some URL. So for that, we can add a using statement. We'll say variable content is equal to, we will create a string content. For that, we need the JSON object. So we have JSON content, comma, we will use encoding.utf8, and I will add the using statement. It will be UTF8, so I'll have to correct that as well. And we need to give our media type. This is a JSON, so we'll say application/JSON. Make sure there is no spelling mistake when you write this. After that, we need to have an HTTP response message that we will receive when we will send data using HTTP client. So for that, we need an object of HTTP client. I can create that right here. But ideally, you will be using iHTTP client factory with dependency injection in .NET Core. I just want to get things up and running quickly. That's why I'm just using a local HTTP client. So here we will say response is equal to await. On that client, we will be calling post async. We want to post something to a URL that we will define right here. And when we are posting, we want to pass our content in there. The path that we will call here will be the logic app URL that we will create. But we have all the skeleton ready to call our logic app. We will make this an async method, so it should have task of iAction result. And rather than returning back to the view, we will reload the page. So we will redirect back to the same action, which is index action. We have the functionality of when the submit button is clicked, it will come to the post action method, convert that to a JSON object, and it will post that to the URL that we paste right here. Now let's take a look at what should happen in our logic app. We have created a form where user can only enter name, email, and phone number. We will add the image later on, but once the user enters name, email, and phone number, we want to write that to our SQL server. This database will be hosted in the cloud. So we will see how we can accomplish that. Once we enter that record in SQL Server, next we want to send out an email. So let's see how we can accomplish all of this using Logic App. Let me switch back to the portal.azure.com. Here, if we close this, let's go to the home page. I already have a SQL Server that I created before. This is a basic SQL Server, and if we go to connection strings, we have the connection string right here. Let's open that up in SQL Server. Right here, let's connect. We will have to get the connection here. Let me get that. We will go back, paste that here, and we have SQL Server authentication. You will have to write your user ID and password that you used when you create the SQL Server. Once we connect to our server, you can notice I have a database which right now has a couple of tables. We won't be working with these two tables, but we will rather create a new table. So I can do new query here, and in order to create the table for our spooky request, I have provided that code inside the snippets folder. So inside snippets, if you go to section 7, we have the create spooky request table. We will copy this and I will paste that here. I'm just creating a table with ID, name, email, phone number, and ID is a primary key. Let's create that, and perfect. That table got created here. Now what we want to do is if we go back to our main application, when we run this application, we want to call an Azure Logic app that will enter all the records of our spooky request inside the SQL database that we have on cloud. How do we do that? In order to do that, let's go back and we will create a new Logic app. We will hit the Add button here. The resource group, we will keep that inside Azure Learning Logic app. We will give that Logic app the name of Spooky Request Entry in Database. We will keep the region and let's hit Review plus Create and create this Logic app. Let's go to the resource here and start the designing. The first question you should ask is when this Logic app will be triggered. It will be triggered when we post all of the data inside our HTTP post action method using post async. That's why it will be when an HTTP request is received. That is when we have to call. The next thing here is we have to write the JSON schema. We can get that pretty easily if we switch back to the application and if we add a debugging point. Let me make sure the startup project is Azure Spooky Logic and let me run the project. Once the page loads, let me populate the details here and hit the apply button. If you hover on the JSON content, we have the data right here. So we can just copy this, go back to the Azure portal, and right here you see we have used sample payload to generate the schema. So here if we paste the general payload, it will automatically generate the schema based off that. So you can see we have type of object and properties, ID is string, name, email, phone number, everything is string. That looks perfect. So you can use this handy tool to generate the schema according to the payload that you are sending. Now right now in the application, nothing will happen because the URL is not valid. So we can just stop that. We only wanted to get a sample payload to generate schema. Next thing here is the parameter and we can define the method name. So the method type that we will be using will be post. With that, let me save the changes that we have so far and the URL will be generated. Perfect. As soon as the app is saved, you can see we have the URL right here. Let's copy this URL and paste that right here inside the post async. So we will remove that and paste the complete URL where we will be posting the message. So this time if you run the application, it will send all of the content to your Logic app. What we have to do is in the next step, once we receive all the data, ID, name, email, and phone number, we actually have to create a record inside the database. Let's see how we can do that in the next video. Once we receive the HTTP request here, next what we want to do is we want to create an entry inside our SQL database. So here we are receiving the HTTP request, then we will have to click the next step. So for next step, we will search for SQL and let's see what options we have. You can see SQL Server is displayed right here. Let's select that and we need to find out the actions. Now when you select SQL Server, you can do quite a few things here. You can delete a row, you can execute a stored procedure, that is usually the most common one, but what we are going to is insert a row. So we want to insert a row inside a SQL Server. Next, Logic app will ask for all the connection to connect to that SQL Server instance. So let me open portal.azure in another tab here and we can go to our SQL Server that we have in Azure. Let's go to the connection string and we will get all the details. For the server, we will copy everything after TCP here. We can also include the port number. The connection name, I will call that Azure SQL Database. Authentication type will be SQL Server Authentication. We will paste the server name that we copied, and for the database name, we have that inside initial catalog. If you go back to your SQL Server, you can see that name right here as well. So let's go back and paste the name here. Let's get the username, which is admin SQL. I'll paste that and I'll type in my password. We do not need the gateway, so we will leave that blank and we will hit the create button. But as soon as we hit the create button, we will run into an error message. You can see here we have the issue with the IP address. Because this IP address is not configured in our SQL Server on Azure, we will copy this IP address, go back to our SQL Server, Overview tab, and we will set the firewall. We will call this Logic App IP, and we will add the IP address here and save it. Now our Logic App will be able to access our SQL database. With that, let's hit the create button one more time, and the error goes away. We have the connection. Here we have to select the server name. If you hover on the drop-down, it will display the server name that we have in connection string. Inside this connection, it will display all of the database. We just have one, which is .NET Mastery Azure SQL, and then it will automatically populate all the tables. What we want to work on is the spooky request. Once you select the spooky request, it will take a while and it will load all of the columns. Great, you can see it asks for ID, name, email, and phone number. Now the values that we want to populate here are the values that we receive in the HTTP request. So how can we extract those values and pass it here? Don't worry, we do not have to do any coding. If you just click here, it will display all the options. Inside the dynamic content, you can see when an HTTP request is received. These are all the parameters that are being passed. So it automatically asks us that do you want to use one of these parameters? And yes, of course we do. We click on ID and that gets populated. Similarly, we will do for name, email, and phone number. This is super simple, as you can see. So this will automatically insert a row based on all of these properties. Let's save this logic app, and now how do we run this? We don't have to do anything to run that. It is automatically running as of now. All we have to do is we need to post a request and it should be triggered automatically. So let's go back to our project and let's run it one more time. Let's enter some details and hit the apply button. The request went away and it redirected back to the home page. Now let's go back to our portal and let's go to our logic apps. Let's examine the logic app that we have for spooky request, and you can see it already ran one time. Let's examine what happened in this run. Both of the paths were completed successfully. Let's see what was the HTTP request that we received. You can see email, ID, name, and phone number were populated. Then it called the insert row, and here it inserted one record successfully. Let's go back to our SQL Server here, and let's examine all the records in the table. And perfect. You can see our record was created inside the database. So you can see how easy it was to create a record inside table using logic apps when we post some data. Now the first piece of our logic app is working. When we post the data, we are writing that to SQL Server. That is great. The next part is we want to send an email with all the details that user populated. How will we do that? We will go back to the Azure portal And I will open up the spooky request entry in Database Logic App, and we will go to the Logic App Designer view. We have only one step here. You can see we have a plus sign. If we want, we can add a step between the HTTP request and insert row. But what we want to do is once the record is inserted, we want to send an email. So let's hit the new step button here. In order to send email, we can use Outlook 365. You can see right here, or you can also use SendGrid. If you type SendGrid here, you can see we have the options right here and what action should it do. We want to send the email, so we will click Send Email v4. At this point, we have to give it a name, so we will call it SendGrid Email Connection, and we need the SendGrid API key. Now I will not go into much details on how you can create an account on SendGrid, validate the single identity, and retrieve the SendGrid API key. I have covered that in many of my other courses, so in this course, make sure you have a valid sender identity, which can only be achieved if you are not using a Gmail or Yahoo account. It should be a domain email like your company's email. So once you have a valid SendGrid API key, you can paste that right here. I already have my SendGrid API key, so I will paste that here and I will hit the Create button. It will ask you for more details, like what is the from email. We will type that, so hello@netmastery.com, and the to email address, let me write that as well. For the subject, we will gain new spooky request, and we need the email body. Now inside email body, let's say we want to pass all the details like what was the name, email, and phone number. So we will say new request received, name, and then we can use the parameters like we did when we inserted the record inside SQL Server. You scroll down inside dynamic content, you can see it does not display anything. But here it displays two steps. First is when HTTP request is received, and next is insert row v2. If you see, all of the steps have some name. The first one is when HTTP request is received, and next one is insert row v2. What happens is in the dynamic content, it is asking us which parameters are you talking about? Are those the input parameters that you received in insert row v2 step, or do you want to use the parameters that you received when an HTTP request is received in the first step? In our case, both of them are same, so we can use any one of them, but you can see how fancy it is that it is asking us which one do we want. Let's say we just want to use the initial parameters, so you can hit the See More button. As soon as you do that, it will display all the other parameters. So we just want to use name, we can write that. In the next line, we can send email, we will enter, and we can give the phone number. Let's write that, and great. You can see this way you can build a dynamic email body. There are also additional parameters if you want, like CC name, attachment, and much more. We will keep things very simple, and let's save this. Once we save the data, let's go back to the application. I believe it's already running. Let me populate some more details. I will just append one at the end to make sure that this is the new request, and we will hit the Apply button. Let's go back to our SQL Server, and we should have one more record right here. Now let's go back to our Logic app, and we go to the Overview tab to see the next trigger that was hit. And we can see there was another Run History. Let's click there. And you can see we have all three checkboxes. This means all the three steps were completed. Let me open up my email to see if I received the email. And perfect. You can see here we received the email with name, email, and phone number. So you can see with Logic app how easy it was to implement the complete flow when we receive a request, we write that to SQL Server and send an email. All the steps are done in less than 30 minutes. If you had to do the same with a .NET application, you would have to set up a project, you would have to deploy the code, and you'll have to take care of all the code and managing that. Here, everything is done automatically with a beautiful UI where you just have to click and manage few things. This was just a quick introduction to Logic Apps. Let me walk you through one more scenario. Right now, we only have name, email, and phone number that we are uploading. Now, let's say you are also uploading a headshot or a resume. So in that case, when we upload that, we want to upload that image to an Azure Blob storage. This will be done inside the .NET Core application that we have. But once that image is uploaded, let's say we want to copy that image to a new folder location inside the Logic app. Now you might argue that rather than uploading to this folder, why not upload to the processed folder directly? That is not the main point. I want to show you another triggers that we have with the Logic app with Azure Storage Blob. So let's implement the .NET Core functionality first and then do the next step using Logic app. So we first need to do some coding inside our main project. We are in the home controller and we need to retrieve an image or a file right here. So first let me go to the index view and I will copy the phone tab that we have, paste it one more time, and we will say headshot or resume. Then instead of phone here, we will have an input with the type of file and some bootstrap classes. Inside the home controller, let me stop the application and we will receive the file right here. Make sure that in your view, you have the enc type multi-part form data so that you can receive the file in iForm file. Now in order to upload the file to Blob storage, we will have to add a NuGet package in our project. So let me click Manage NuGet Package and we will go to the Browse tab. We will have to search for package azure.storage.blobs and let me add that. Now once we do that, we will have to create the Blob service client. I won't go into much details on how the Blob service client works because I have shown that inside the Blob storage. I won't go into the details of how you can set up the Blob service client because that has its own section. But before we configure that, we will have to go back to our Azure portal. And let me close the email here. We will have to go to the home page. I already have a Blob storage. If you do not have it, you will have to create one. Once you add the new Blob storage, you will have to get its connection string. So you will go to Access Keys and we will display the keys, copy the connection string, and paste that inside the app settings. Here we will create a block with the name of Blob connection and let's paste the connection string. Next, we have to configure our Blob service client to use this connection string inside program.cs and add that to dependency injection. So right here inside builder, we will say builder.services.add singleton, new Blob service client. We will add the using statement and we will extract the connection string using configuration. Pretty straightforward with .NET Core. That will set up our connection string and the Blob service client that we can use with dependency injection. So the next step here is to configure the Blob service client using dependency injection. Then let's scroll down and we want to upload that image. So we'll say if file is not null, in that case we want to upload the blob. If we go back to our PowerPoint, we want to create a container with the name of Logic App Holder. So let's go back to the portal and let's go here in the containers of our storage account. Let's create that container. It is Logic App Holder. We'll keep the access as container for now, and let's create. After that, we will have to copy that image to logic app holder hyphen processed. So let me create that container as well. We will keep the access as container, and let's create. Great, so initially the image should be uploaded here from our .NET Core application. So let me switch back to the application and we will configure that. The first thing is the file name. We will rename the file name to have the same name as the ID of the request so we can merge them later on if we have to. So we can say variable file name is spooky.id plus the extension of the file that is uploaded. Next, in order to upload, we will have to create a Blob container client and we will use the method getBlobContainerClient inside the Blob service client. The container that we created is logic app holder, so it will get that container instance. On that container instance, we will have to get a Blob client on the file name. Next, we will have to set the content type that is inside file.contentType, so we will set that inside the Blob HTTP headers. And the last step that remains is to upload the blob. So on Blob client, we have upload async where we can upload the blob with the HTTP headers. So with this, when we upload the image this time, it will be uploaded to the Blob container. In the next video, let's continue working on our logic app.